Okay, so this is the Bible study for First Samuel chapter 29, and the text says, "The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, 'What about these Hebrews?' Achish replied, 'Is this not David who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from that day he left Saul until now. From the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him.' But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, 'Send the man back that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s.' So Achish called David and said to him, 'As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers.' 'But what have I done?' asked David. 'What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go fight against the enemies of my lord the king?' Achish answered, 'I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light.' So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel." All right. So we've been building to this. We've been in suspense on pins and needles, waiting for what would happen. We took a pause last week because we visited Saul's side of the battle and what Saul was doing to try to get God on his side and find out the will of God. Um, Probably not find out the will of God. He said that's what he wanted, but in the end, I'm not sure that's what he really wanted. And then we're back to David and the Philistines and King Achish. So remember that you can download PDF copies of this Bible study so that you can follow along with us as we ask and answer questions about this text at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And number one in our Bible study for today says, "What happened in our last study in 1 Samuel 28? A, Saul was afraid of the Philistines who were lined up against him. That's true. B, God was not answering Saul when he asked if everything was going to be okay. That's true. C, Saul consulted a medium to bring up Samuel so he could find out the will of God. That's true. And then D, Samuel told Saul what he probably already knew, that David was going to take over his kingdom and that he and his sons would be killed. And maybe more importantly, Samuel said, 'You and your sons will be with me tomorrow.' And so wherever Samuel was, I think the concept of that was he'll be dead tomorrow and you'll no longer be walking this earth, which was surely not what Saul wanted to hear. Number two says, "What about the previous study in chapter 27, which maybe is more important in introducing this text? A, David fled to Gath with his 600 men. B, David lived there for a year and 4 months. C, David had convinced Achish that he was raiding his own people. Yes, D, Achish made it clear that David would fight on the side of the Philistines against the Israelites when they lined up in battle. Yes. E, we were wondering how God might bring this difficult situation to a resolution that glorified him. And that's all true. So we sort of left chapter 27 on a cliffhanger that didn't get resolved in chapter 28. And the question was, how do you think God is going to resolve this situation. And we really talked about how sometimes the place where that Bible study left us, that text left us on that cliffhanger, is where we find ourselves when we go to prayer in our lives. We're in the middle of a situation. It's hard to see how God is going to resolve it, but here we are in prayer talking to God, um, and trying to find out, and really honestly trying to trust and believe that God does have a solution, when perhaps it's not natural for us to trust, or it's not our first instinct. It's our first instinct to fear, unfortunately. And that's maybe a more real moment in our lives than a lot of the other moments we talk about in these Bible studies. Number three says, what is happening now in 29, 1 through 3? A, the Philistines were gathering their forces with the Philistine rulers marching in their units. That's true. B, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. Yes, that's true. C, the commanders of the Philistines asked Achish why these Hebrews were marching out with them. They said, what about these Hebrews? What about them? Why are they here? They're like with us. That's the wrong team. This isn't going to work out. D, Achish answered them that David and his men had been with him for over a year and had left Saul. So, Achish is trusting David. Now, I don't know. I was wondering, but it's just something we can't know. What would David have done if he ended up in battle? Were the commanders right? Obviously Achish trusted David, but Achish's trust in David was based on some lies, actually, right? Because David was telling him that he was raiding his own people. So in Achish's mind, he's already been fighting his own people. He's already been hurting his own people. So I can trust him. But it turns out that's not really what he was doing. So what would David have done? Would he have turned on Achish in the middle of the battle? Um, would he have really killed Israelites? I don't think so. Um, I have a hard time knowing David's general integrity, thinking that he would have turned on Achish after what Achish had done for him. Um, maybe he didn't have a plan, but I do think the commanders were right to suspect, because I don't think David was going out there intent on fighting Saul. And we know that because David would not even um, touch Saul when he was had the opportunity. And I actually think this is God's provision for David in multiple ways, because Samuel has already said, you and your sons are going to be with me tomorrow. But we know how David felt about Jonathan. And I don't believe that David would have had a hand in killing Saul based on what we've seen, or certainly not Jonathan. Um, and if they're dying in this battle, then David does not want to be in this battle. And so God provided for David both in resolving the um, surely the internal conflict that David was going to have in all this, but also in making it so that David was not even involved in the battle that would ultimately take the life of Saul and his sons, which just provides for David's um, um, concerns and what he did not want to be a part of. Number four says, how did the Philistine commanders respond according to verses 2 through 5? It says they were angry with Achish. B, they demanded that he send David and his men back. Yes. C, they were sure that David would turn against them in the middle of the battle in order to regain Saul's favor. And yes, that's what they said. D, they reminded Achish of the song the people had sang about David. So here comes that song again. That song has been troubling pretty much throughout since it was sung the first time. It's caused David not really, it hasn't helped him a bit. It seemed so wonderful when those women all ran out to meet the army and sang this song about David. But it has been, this song has caused nothing but trouble since then. Number five, what did Achish do according to verses 6 through 11? A, Achish assured David that he found no fault with him. And B, Achish asked David to do as the Philistine rulers had requested without doing anything to anger them. So, yeah, it does seem already like the Philistines are a group of sort of independent uh, city states, if you will, with commanders and leaders of each, but somehow Achish has become the leader of all of them. But it does seem like his leadership is dependent on those commanders following him, and so he um, does exactly what they want him to, despite him feeling like David had done nothing wrong and he trusted David. And he seems it was really important to him to reassure him. And David even asked, "What have I done?" And he said, "Nothing. Just don't make these guys mad. Just go back, like they say." And by the way, the Philistines have had no problems with Israel in terms of being able to defeat them most of the time. So I don't think they needed David in the battle to win. Unless, of course, it was one of those battles when God showed up with them, which seems to have been rare in recent history there. Number six, how did David respond? He did ask him, what have I done? Um, Number seven, but ultimately he went back. And we're going to learn next week what they found when they came back, and perhaps this is another provision that God provided for him as well. Um, because when they get back, they find the Amalekites have come in again and caused them trouble, and so he's able to go back and take care of that situation and find that probably earlier than he would have. So we see God's hand all over this in removing David from this battle. Number seven, is this God's provision for David? Yes. And I think I've already listed three different ways that God used this sort of encounter or um, allowance to provide for David. The second part, did David recognize God's provision here? Maybe. Maybe he's just putting on a little show. Oh, Akish, I've got to go back. Oh no, maybe he really did see it as God's provision. On the other hand, David's a warrior, and maybe he really was ready to go to battle. Maybe he didn't recognize it. Maybe he was upset. And I put that in there because sometimes God is providing, and we think that something's just happened that's unfair, or we think we're being removed from a position and we've lost something and we don't see it as God's provision. So I'm not sure. I have to think that David surely saw this as God's provision and maybe was just putting on a little show for Achish and quietly internally praising God. But I don't know, maybe because sometimes we don't see God's provision when it happens, right? The third part says, do we recognize this God's provision when it comes? Yes, no, explain. Sometimes not. Sometimes we think it's the worst thing that's ever happened to us, and it turns out God was using it to provide for us all along. And then the last part, do we believe that God's provision is going to come when we're in difficult situations? When we're in that cliffhanger moment that we ended off with in chapter 27, do we really think that God is going to provide and he's going to work there? And I'm afraid often we don't. Um, so we need to see that. We need to trust in God. And it's easier said than done, but God is our provider and he's faithful. And whatever problem we're in, he has an answer for it.